Hey everyone, how's it going? So all you're going to need for this video is Visual Studio Code. Thanks to the beauty of open source code, there are some extensions we can get that will let us both see and use SQLite right in Visual Studio Code. So if you don't already have Visual Studio Code, be sure to install it before you watch the rest of this video if you want to follow along. I'm going to split this up into two parts. The first part is going to be a slideshow. It's just going to be explaining what SQL and SQLite is. If that doesn't sound interesting to you, or you already have a good basic understanding of SQL, feel free to check the description for the timestamps and skip right to when we start actually working with it in Visual Studio Code. Alright, so of course the first thing here is going to be what's a database. For any of you who don't know, a database is simply just a place where you can store data. So think about programs that we've made so far, like the random password generator. Let's say you wanted to store each password you made. For that, you would need a database. A common thing to do is use something called SQL, which stands for Structured Query Language. This is essentially how you can communicate with a database. This is how you put information into a database, how you take it out, and how you just read what's in it. So for this, we're going to be using something called SQLite. This is essentially a lighter version of SQL. Actual SQL or MySQL databases use what's known as a server. This is serverless, so we can just do it out of a file. It still uses the basic ideas of SQL, but it's a lot easier to work with, and it's better for if you're just making a little project yourself. Now let's see what a database would look like. Here's a simple example of a database. This database here is called My Database. It has two tables inside of it. One is called a users table, the other is called users videos. So imagine this, you have a website which allows you to create an account, log in, and then upload videos. Does that sound familiar? Because that's what you're watching this on. You'll see here each table can have whatever you want in it. These are all things that I would have set up. So we have one column for username, one column for password, and one column for email. Now, this table can have as many rows as we want, right? These are the columns which we set, and then we just insert rows of data. So for each new user, they're going to have a username, a password, and an email. I already filled one out to give you an idea of what it would look like. So the username here is my username. The password here is password. It doesn't have to be the same as that. I should have named it my password. Sorry if that's confusing. And the email here is mike@gmail.com. Now in the users videos, you'll see the username here is the same as the username there, which we'll get into in a little bit. There's also a video title, which here is something important, and a video link, which is just a link. So let's say my username, that user, wanted to make another video. What we would be doing is we'd put another video with the same username, probably a different title, and definitely a different link inside of this table. But we wouldn't be adding any more columns, just rows. And each row would contain all three of these values. This way, if we wanted to do what's called querying a table, which is just searching through the table, let's say we wanted to get all of the videos by somebody with this username. Similar to if you click on my channel, it'll show you all of my videos. We can do that, and I'll show you how to do that in a bit by using a select statement, but we're going to get into that once we get into the code. Right now, I just want to let you know that that's a possible thing, and that's why these tables exist and are laid out the way they are. Additionally, of course, you could add another user in the same way you'd add another video, right? It would have a username, a password, and an email. Now we're going to talk about SQLite data types. Now there's 5 data types. We've already covered a few of these, right? A null variable is not empty, it is null. It's slightly different. An integer, which is just a number that doesn't have a decimal. Text is really just a string, so think of it like a string in PHP. A real is really just a float. So think of it just like a float in PHP. And a blob is a bit interesting. A blob can be thought of as just whatever's thrown into that column. This could be something unique, perhaps an image or a document. It doesn't necessarily have to follow the rules that these other ones have to follow. And that's something else I should mention. They all follow rules. You couldn't have, an integer that's a string. You couldn't have a string that's an integer. It's a little bit more strict than PHP. And of course, you couldn't upload an image and say that it's a number or null. Next up, we're going to talk about primary and foreign keys. So a primary key can be thought of as a unique key. This is something that will be unique in the table. So I'm going to flip to the next slide for a second. You'll see here, username has a star, right? Username here could be a primary key. And the reason for that is because username would be unique, right? How many times have you tried to sign up for a website and they've said, I'm sorry, this username's already taken? That's why they say it. It's because it's a primary key. All usernames have to be unique. And this is important because since it's unique, we can use it in the user's videos as well. Imagine trying to get my YouTube channel's videos. If it didn't have a primary key, it would be impossible, right? Because you'd be pulling in so many different videos that aren't mine. I gave it a star to show that it's a primary key, so hopefully that helps you understand it a little bit better. I should also mention that all SQLite tables can only have one primary key. They can't have any more than that. Now, next up, we're going to go back and we're going to talk about foreign keys. Foreign keys are a unique attribute that you can give a column similar to primary keys, but they're slightly different. Foreign keys are used to link one table to another. So here with this star example, what we could say is this is the primary key, but it's also the foreign key, right? Because you have a username here and a username here. So they're linking the two tables. Now, you don't need it to be a primary key for it to be a foreign key, but in a lot of cases, it can be helpful. It's what's known as a one-to-one relationship. Now, I'm not going to get too into relationships and all the various database schemas because I want this to be a simple crash course. But if you're interested, you could totally look into it and get more in depth with SQL. And with that, that's the end of our slide. This is just a very basic understanding of SQL that we're going to be using for programming SQLite. Hopefully this all made sense. If it didn't, let me know. Alright, so now we're moving on to the setup. What you're going to want to do is open up Visual Studio Code and make sure it is Visual Studio Code. The text editor does matter for this one. And then you're going to want to open a new folder. I just named mine SQLite and I opened it. Now inside of the extensions, you're going to type SQLite, SQLite, just like that. And you're going to want to download this one. It'll probably be the first one. It's by Alex CVZZ. Once that's downloaded, make a new file. And let's just call it test.db. This is going to be our database. The next thing we can do is make a new file. Let's call it sql.sql. Now inside here, what we're going to be doing is typing our SQL that we're going to run. So let's say Control-Shift-P all at the same time. Hit those keys. If you're on a Mac, it's going to be Command. And then type SQLite, and you're going to want to pick the one that says Run Query. And you should see this open up. Now what we can do is type our SQL, and then we can run it, and it'll go right to the database. If it asks you to select a database, which it probably will, just select test.db or whatever you named your database, but do make sure that it has that DB extension. Now the first thing we're going to do is create a table. I'm going to be creating the same two tables that we saw previously. So I'm going to say create table. This is going to be called users. And then what we're going to want to do here is in these parentheses, pass it all of the columns. We have a username column, password, and email with a semicolon at the end. Okay, I'm going to close this, and then what we want to do is make sure that they're all not null. You can do that by saying not null, and then I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to put the same thing after each one of these. We space it out a little bit. After not null, let's also say that we want it to be of type text for the username, and we want that to be the primary key. Once this is all set, you can hit Control Shift and P at the same time and run the query. Error in your text, sorry, text has to go before not null. And there we go. We have our table created. You'll see that if I try to run it again, it'll give me an error that the table already exists. That's perfect. What we're going to do now is comment it out. Now you could also just delete it, but it'd probably be better for you to comment it so that you'll know how to do this again in the future. You'll have something to reference. Now let's do an insert statement. We're going to do this in order to put some data into the table. What we can say here is insert into users. And then let's get all the columns. So we have username, password, and email. Now we're going to give it some values. First one's going to be Mike. The second one is going to be my password. And the third one is going to be an email. So let's say mike@yahoo.com. Now, something that I should note is that for all three of these, they're strings, right? So what do strings get? They get quotes. So let's put our quotes around it. And let me just explain a little bit as to how this works. It goes in chronological order. So it's going to say we're going to insert into usernames the first value because it's the first column that we list. Password, second column. Email, third column. So let's run this. And now it might look like nothing changed, but something you can do here is you can say open database. I'm going to pick that database. And then I can open this SQLite Explorer, and you'll see inside of this users table down here, sorry if this is a little small, but you'll see that we actually do have one user, right? And there they are. It's me. Okay. I'm going to close this out though, and I'm going to show you a more traditional way to do this. Comment out this value. And in Visual Studio Code, if you highlight something and you hold Control and you press the quote button and the question mark button at the same time, it'll comment and uncomment it out, which is super handy when you have a lot of lines. What I'm going to say here is select star from. Also, something else I should mention is that things that I make capital, like I can make this capital or I cannot. It doesn't matter. It's just good practice to make words like this capital so that you know what is a keyword and what isn't, and it's easier to read. But you really don't have to do it if you don't want to. So let's say select all from users. And then again, we're going to run it. And you'll see it does the exact same thing we just saw. Because what we're doing here is we're saying, give me all of the users. So let's comment this out. Uncomment the insert. And I'm going to change this. Let's change this to Joe. Joe's password. Make the email joe@yahoo.com. Run it. Comment it out. And then we'll do another select statement. And you'll see now we get Mike and Joe because it's giving us everything. Select is basically how we read from it. In PHP, we're going to be using this, and in any programming language, you would do something like this, and then you would set a variable equal to that. right? So maybe if I wanted to get all the usernames, I could make an array of all the usernames using the array push function or something like that. Now let's say we don't want to select all. What if we only want to select the username? There we go. Now we just have the username, but we're still getting all of the usernames. Well, there's something that we can do here where it's called a where clause, and we can say where. This is very similar to saying if in a programming language. We can say where, let's say password, or you know what, let's say select password from users where username equals Joe, and Joe is a string, so let's not forget our quotes, and run it, and you'll see all we got here is Joe's password. We didn't get my password. If we delete the where, we get both the passwords. So it's basically saying, give me all the passwords from the users, but only where the username equals Joe. Now, you got to remember, the only primary key here is the username. So it's only going to give us one password. But what if we went by email, right? Right now, email isn't a primary key. So we could have 6 users with the same email. And if we were to say where email equals, joe@yahoo.com, we might get 6 passwords. And that's really the beauty of this. This is how you would limit your database query. Because you could have a 2 terabyte database full of an obscene amount of data. Or even a small database would still be full of an obscene amount of users. I mean, just imagine having to look at a list of 3,000 users when all you need is the one who's got the username Joe, or maybe the first name Joe. And one other thing that's interesting I want to show you is what happens when we try to copy a primary key. So let's run this again. Let's make it Jack, leave the password and the email the same. It gives us no problems. Now let's run it again. Jack still is the username. We get an error. And the reason we get this error is because it's a primary key. And like I said before, the primary key has to be unique in the table. You don't necessarily need one, but more times than not, you're going to want one. And that's what makes SQL so powerful. One thing I'm going to talk about next is the in operator. So here we can say where username, and instead of equals, let's say in. And in parentheses, let's say Joe, comma, Mike. Actually, I think I made Mike lowercase. And let's run that. And awesome. You'll see we get both Joe's password and my password, which was Mike's, but we don't get Jack's, right? Now in is basically an or statement. So you can think of it like this. Everyone that has this username is going to be considered valid, right? And we're going to get their password in this case. Of course, if we change this something like email, we'll get their email. There's a few other things we could do. We could say between, which would be great if we were doing numbers, right? Let's say we're doing numbers and we wanted to get everything between maybe 1 and 10. And instead of username, we could say, let's get the email of everyone who has emails sent that's between 1 and 10. That's not a column in our database. We aren't tracking emails, but imagine if we were, that's something we could do. We aren't tracking any integers here, so there's no point in using between. I just wanted to show you that it exists. One other thing that I'd like to show you is like. So what we can say is where username like. And what we can do here is we can put some kind of a symbol. And I'm going to pull this up really quick and not actually show you in code because I think it'll be more useful. This is W3 Schools. It's a great resource for learning all kinds of programming. This is the regular SQL. They don't have an SQLite version, but the like operator works the same in SQLite. Now you'll see here, they're trying to find any value. Let me zoom in a little bit. They're trying to find any value that starts with an A. And in order to do that, they're putting a percent after the A, and it's a quote, right? So if we wanted anything that starts with an M, what we could say is like M percent, and ideally we'd get Mike's email. Let's run it and see. Perfect, we did. Now let's change this to J. We got 2 emails, right? Because we have Jack and Joe. I really should have given Jack a Jack email to make it more obvious. I'm sorry about that. But there's other things we could do too, right? If we put the percent sign at the beginning, you could find any value that ends with an A. You could do double percent, which finds any value that has whatever you put in between in any position. So maybe I'd put Mike, and that way if it was a list of full names, I'd get all the people who have the first name Mike, but it would also give me somebody who might have the last name Mike. If they're somebody who has 2 first names, we could put an underscore at the beginning and a percent sign at the end, which is going to find it if it's in the second position. Do the same thing, but put the underscore after the first letter, which is going to find it if it starts with that character and is at least 2 characters in length. Then we could do the same thing, but with 2 of them, which will find it if it's 3 characters in length. And lastly, we could do percent and then something else, which is going to find something that starts with 1 letter and ends with another. And that's the last one I'm going to test here. So let's say M percent, and let's just throw it off. Let's say I. We don't have any usernames that start with M and end with I, so let's see what we get. And we get nothing, like we should. But if I switch this to E, we do get mine, because my name starts with an M and ends with an E. So hopefully that makes sense. The next topic I'd like to talk about is updating. Instead of just inserting, we can also update a table. So to start us off, let's just say select email from this user, right, from Mike. Now we know when we run this, what we're going to get is mike@yahoo.com. So let's comment this out. And let's make a new thing. Let's say update users. And then I'm going to say set. Now what I want to do here is set the email equal to not mike@gmail.com. And then we're going to do this where the username equals Mike. Let's run this. Okay, we didn't get any errors, so let's comment this out and uncomment our select statement. And you'll see now the email is not mike@gmail.com. So that's essentially updating it. What we do here is we say we're going to update something, we give it the name of the table, and then we say set, and we're going to give it the columns here that we want to set. If I wanted to also set the password, I could put a comma and say password equals, sorry, that was a period, but I could put a comma and say password equals, and then just say something. And then the last thing we're doing is where. We're saying where we want to update, right? Because we don't want to update every email to this. So that's updating. The last thing is delete. So we know now when we select this, we get our email, right? Well, let's delete it. Let's say delete from users. and we're going to delete the row where username equals Mike. I'm going to comment out the select again, and I'm going to run it. Okay, we didn't get an error. Let's uncomment this. Let's run it. We're not getting anything, right? It seems like it's almost broken. But you'll see here, if we change this to username equals Joe, we do get something. And that's because what we just did was we deleted the entire row of Mike from the database. So to give you an idea of what this looks like now, let's do a select all from users. And you'll see that the table, and you'll see that the row in the table is completely gone. There's no longer a Mike. That's going to be it for this tutorial. There's a whole lot more that you can learn about SQL and SQLite. This is just a crash course to get you up and running. Please reach out in the comments if you have any questions or you'd like to know something. I'm going to be continuing my tutorial series after this by going on to using this with PHP. If that's something that sounds interesting to you, feel free to check it out and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a great day.